Color. We all know what it is. We're surrounded by color every day. But in order to work with it effectively, we have to understand some of its properties, and we need to understand how to combine colors together. In this series of videos, we are going to look at color and how to work with it using Adobe Illustrator. The first thing we have to think about when we're talking about colors are the properties of color. Understanding color properties allows us to evaluate individual colors. But colors are more interesting when they're put together with other colors, which creates color harmonies. And all of these colors have direct effects on the people who see them. We're going to talk about all of these ideas. But first, let's talk about color properties. When we're talking about color, we have to make sure that we're using the right words. There are a lot of ways to describe color, but when artists and designers talk about color, they use these particular words. The first is value. This describes how light or dark a particular color is. The next term is hue. This describes where on the color wheel that color resides. We'll talk more about the color wheel in a moment. The last color property that we need to understand is saturation. This refers to the amount of color that we see in any one particular point. Let's talk about each one of these. The first, and perhaps the most important of all of them, is value, sometimes also known as brightness, especially when we're talking about digital color. We often describe value in terms of a grayscale, like this. Every color has a value or brightness level that we often give a numerical number to. For example, a color that is a 2 on our value scale is a fairly light color, whereas 9 or 10 is something that's getting close to black. The reason I say it's one of the most important of the color properties is because value is also a compositional element. Edge value contrast is one of the ways we direct our eyes through a composition. So in some respects, a color's value does double duty. Let's take a look at an example. These two squares share the same hue, a blue-green, but their value is extremely different. Some people will sometimes use the terms high tone and low tone to describe color, but what they're really referring to is the color's value. Let's take a look at the next property of color. Hue. We've all seen light through a spectrum, or the colors of a rainbow, but it took an 18th century German philosopher to take the spectrum and put it into a circle like we see here. It turns out to have been a very fortuitous thing for him to have done. And as we see here, this circle shows us the continuous hue shift, but artists and designers have abstracted this color wheel to make it a little bit more easy to work with. These 12 colors are very familiar to most Western viewers. Some cultures don't recognize the difference between red and orange. And the Russian language has a separate word for light blue and sees it as a separate color completely. But by and large, just with these 12 colors, we've been able to do quite a lot. There's one more simplification, though, I'd like to make to this color wheel. I do like to think of them in terms of warm and cool colors. As we will see when we start doing color harmonies, combining warm and cool colors can be very exciting, but sometimes a little challenging. The last color property I want to talk about is saturation. Saturation is sometimes hard to describe. It really just refers to the amount of color that we see. Here, for example, all three of these squares share the same hue. Their values are also almost identical. The only thing that's changed is the color saturation. On the left, we see that color at almost full saturation. On the right, we see that color at low saturation, which is almost indistinguishable from gray. As we will see, saturation can play a large role in the emotional response of a viewer. For example, these high saturation posters suggest an energy appropriate for an event or a concert, whereas these low saturation color compositions suggest a much more reflective experience. As graphic designers, we want to be able to use value, hue, and saturation to better convey our content. Now, while color properties allow us to talk about individual colors, color is really most interesting when we start combining them together. And when we combine colors together, we call that color harmony, borrowing the analogy of musical notation. And like musical notation, we have found that certain colors work well together. Let's take a look at the major color harmonies. The first is the monochromatic color harmony. A color harmony suggests two different colors, but a monochromatic color harmony is made up of one color and a variety of shades and tints of that color. If we again go back to the analogy of musical notation, these colors are like the same note played an octave apart. There's not much shift in the emotional content. In terms of the color wheel, we can see that it is just really a one-color color scheme. In this composition, we can see that a variety of shades and tints of the color blue have been used. Monochromatic color schemes are very useful, especially if you are looking to create imagery that is meant to recede or to create a very quiet response in the viewer. Let's take a look at a different color harmony. Analogous color schemes are combinations of colors that exist right next to each other on the color wheel. While there is a shift in hue between these colors, it's not great. And because of that, these colors tend to look good together. For example, in this composition, with a very similar color scheme, most of these colors exist fairly close to each other on the cool side of the color wheel. Now, I particularly love working with analogous color schemes for one particular reason, which is to add an accent color. For example, here, I've added an orange-red to the composition. The addition of an accent color like this brings up the idea of color hierarchy, which we will talk about in just a moment. But the accent color we see here wasn't chosen at random. That color is specifically the complement of the blue-green that we see as the dominant color scheme, which brings up the next of our color harmonies, the complementary. Complementary colors are colors that exist on opposite sides of the color wheel. For example, here, blue and orange. The reason they have the name complementary is that colors that are situated next to their complement look richer. Blues will look more blue and oranges more orange when they are placed next to each other, as we see here. See how blue and orange complement each other in this composition. And this goes for any two colors opposite each other on the color wheel. For example, yellow and purple are complementary colors. This is probably one of the most common types of color harmonies that we see in art and design. Let's take a look at another one. A split complementary is like a regular complementary color scheme, except that one of the complements is replaced by two colors on either side of it. I think the reason why this color scheme was developed was similar to my use of accent colors with analogous color schemes. Another very common color scheme is the triadic color scheme. The triadic color scheme gets its name from the shape that gets inscribed inside the color wheel. A triadic color scheme is three colors that are equally spaced along the color wheel. In this color scheme example, we see the secondary colors green, orange, and purple composing this composition. Finally, let's end our exploration of color harmonies by talking about a tetradic color scheme. And like the triadic color scheme, the tetradic color scheme gets its name from the shape that gets inscribed inside the color wheel. In this case, a four-pointed or tetradic rectangle. The tetradic color scheme is essentially just two complementary color schemes combined, as we see here. As we add colors to our color harmonies, you can see it becomes harder and harder to make those color harmonies work together, which is one of the reasons why I always suggest you limit your color schemes to 4 to 5 colors and their shades and tints. Now, I mentioned earlier the idea of color hierarchies. Here, for example, is our main color. We could think of this as our dominant color, and as we add another color to it from the analogous color scheme, this color is going to be my secondary color, and this will be my accent. The smallest color. This highlights that color hierarchy is mostly about the space a color occupies, not about any particular property that color has. As you are working with your color compositions, always keep in mind color hierarchy.